The Nerdcast Empire is on the air. It is Music Mondays once again on the Nerdcast Empire. I am Matt in the studio. We are ready to take a look at the best music releases of March the 29th, and some good releases again for this date. And helping me do this, as always, in studio is Mike. Mike, how's it going?
It is going. We are almost through the first quarter of the year, so that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, that's pretty wild as far as music goes. We are right to the end of March. We'll be heading into quarter two next week. And we're almost to the 50th episode of the Nerdcast Empire. Tonight's episode is number 49, which is pretty crazy that we have gotten this far. Joining us from Parts Unknown is Chris. Chris, how's it going?
Pretty excited for episode 50. And it's kind of crazy that we've been going on for so long. It feels like time has just flown by. It
really has. I think because we were recording so many episodes now, it just feels like we go from one to the next, and there's not really a whole lot of time in between, but we've really enjoyed it. Really appreciate everybody that shared our posts, that has given us great reviews on the podcasting sites. We certainly encourage that to continue. If you don't do anything else other than to share our posts on social media, to listen to our podcasts when they come out, give us a good review. Don't have to spend a dime to do any of those things, but they're super helpful to us. We really appreciate it. We do have merch on our website, nerdcastempire.com/store. We do have a Ko-fi page as well. Whatever you'd want to do if you want to support us financially, we appreciate that as well. But honestly, again, just supporting us by sharing posts, listening to our podcast, a big help for sure. This week, we're looking at the music from March the 29th. And of course, just like we do each and every week, we'll each give you two albums that we are picking as our best albums of the week. And then after the break, we'll go into the vault where we will take a look at some classic albums that you definitely need to check out. So without further ado, we will get started with this week's choices. And as always, we'll go to Mike first. Of course, Mike produces a giant list each and every week that we go through to pick these choices. And about this time in the YouTube video, you should see something pop up at the top of the screen that will take you to Mike's playlist. But if you want to see all of the videos that Mike has put together that had releases on March the 29th, you can do that by clicking on that link at the top of the screen. Now, if you're listening on the podcast, go check the YouTube page. You can find that link there. But we're going to go to Mike first. Mike, you've got two choices this week, as always. What is your first choice of the week?
Yeah, I really didn't make this pick with my vault pick in mind, but it's kind of interesting how it ended up tying together in a weird way. My first pick is a band that's been around since 1984, and I believe this is their 26th studio album. This is a classic German metal band called Rage with their newest album, After Lifelines.
I'm amazed on this podcast at how many of these bands we've come across that have been doing this forever, and we're just now discovering them. It's really hard to believe, but tell us about Rage.
Yeah, so this is a German heavy metal band formed in 84 by Peter P.V. Wagner. This band, who kind of flew under my radar, is kind of referred to as one of Germany's big four of power metal, along with Gravedigger, Helloween, and Running Wild. Obviously, Helloween, huge band in my music history. Really cool stuff. It's a really long album. It's 2 discs. The first half of it is music that the band performed and recorded as a trio, while the second half includes orchestral arrangements, which kind of gives it even more of that like full-bodied power metal assault. Definitely has classic metal feel to it. Not so much on the, how to best describe that. It's not over the top power metal, I don't think. It's still very rooted in classic metal, but that's certainly not a bad thing. If you're a fan of thrash metal, power metal, or just want to hear a band that's been kicking for a really long time and still doing really well, check this out with songs like End of Illusions, Under a Black Crown, Justice Will Be Mine, Root of Our Evil. Top to bottom, it's just a really quality album.
I thought this was our best album of the week. Of the 6 new albums that we're choosing, I thought this Rage album was the best one. I think the review on Maximum Volume Music probably made the best point. They wanted to put out a 40th anniversary album, which is what this turned out to be, but they didn't want to just go with here's our greatest hits album of all the stuff we've done. They wanted to actually put out something that was representative of the awesome music they put out, but put out something new, and they've knocked it out of the park. I mean, it makes you want to go back and listen to those other 20 some albums, because these guys are awesome. Like you said, not really over the top power metal in maybe what you would consider to be the traditional way. But at the same time, I read several reviews that said this was some of the hardest rock that Rage has done. So I think maybe that is it, maybe this is them kind of branching off into maybe more of a heavy thrash style than what you might see on some of their earlier stuff.
Yeah, it doesn't give you the impression that this band's been around 40 years when you hear it. Like, there's nothing about it feels stale. It's very aggressive and just really high quality.
Yeah, no question about it. Really enjoyed Rage with After Lifelines. Chris, your thoughts on Rage?
Yeah, I didn't feel as bad when you said that you hadn't really heard of them either, being kind of our power metal expert here. But I feel like even still, not being a huge power metal fan before we started this podcast, I am kind of sad that I hadn't heard of them, but I'm happy I have now. Being a part of a big four in any country, I mean, it's kind of crazy. Like we always say, that it's taken this long to kind of witness this band or realize that they've been here for so long.
Yeah, no question about it. And it's great to finally get to check out their stuff. And again, very interested in checking out more of their stuff. So definitely check out Rage with After Lifelines, Mike's first choice of the week. You got 2 choices each and every week. Let's take a look at your second pick for the week.
Yeah, for my second pick, I kind of went a little off the really heavy or power metal-y wagon, so to speak. This is a band from Athens, Greece that described themselves as all things occult metal. This is Saturday Night Satan with their album All Things Black.
I'll be honest, when I saw the name of this group, and I don't mean this in any kind of like religious way, but just that name kind of gave me bad vibes. I thought this is probably going to be kind of cringy and I'm not going to enjoy it. Was totally surprised and pleased to be wrong about it, because this is another really good album.
Yeah, I didn't know what to think when I first pulled them up, because obviously you have the name, then you have their logo, which has a very kind of 70s design to it. And then you have the cover art, which is just this cat, like big cat head right on the top of the album. I really had no idea where that was going to go. And it's kind of, as some background, it's a studio side project of Jim Kotzitz, who is a member of the metal band Black Soul Horde, featuring Kate Soulthorne on vocals. It was kind of meant to just be a studio thing, but they've since kind of built a live touring act and really running with it. The music itself is obviously very centered around occult horror movie type themes, with the music kind of being a blend of like 70s through 90s hard rock, a little stonerish at times, but just it has a really clean retro rock sound. A kind of band that you could see touring with like Ghost or Blood Opera. I think they would fit into that mold, both with the themes and the sound.
Yeah, definitely got that Ghost vibe, and not necessarily like sound for sound, but just like you said, kind of the feeling that you get when you listen to them kind of reminded me of a group like Ghost.
Yeah, for sure. And on this album, there's a video for Devil in Disguise, which is really good. Also really enjoyed Rule with Fire, All Things Black, By the River, and Of Love in the Void.
Yeah, it's funny. I got done listening to this one, and I don't think there's a such genre, although there's so many metal genres, it's hard to know. I don't think there's a such genre as easy listening metal. But I felt like this album could actually fit into easy listening metal, because I thought even with those dark topics that you mentioned, it was such an easy listen. It was not, sometimes you get into the occult and you get into metal and it gets really grungy and dark, and sometimes it can be noisy. This wasn't any of that. I thought it was a very easy listen. Every track is really good on its own. And for what is a debut album, I thought it was really great, and I'm kind of excited to see where this group goes from here. Will they tour? Will they tour internationally? It'd be interesting to see, but was really impressed with Saturday Night Satan with All Things Black. Chris, your thoughts?
I'm glad that you were able to come up with a phrase for it, because I was sitting there trying to put my finger on what it was, how I wanted to describe them, and easy listening, I guess, is kind of perfect. The opening track, 5 a.m., just has this really subtle keyboard in it that just kind of drew me into the album as a whole. And then I know Mike mentioned Rule with Fire. I really love that too. It's another one of those kind of intros that reminded me of The Zoo by the Scorpions. Yeah. Really like that kind of plodding bass line. Always love anything occult related, and it looks like they're going both feet in here. In fact, they're going to be the opening act off of their Facebook for a band called Lucifer in all of their live shows in Athens. So glad they have this kind of moniker to stick with, and I'm here to see what they come out with next.
I feel like Lucifer was just on one of your lists a few weeks ago for something new that they were releasing, or we read something about them.
I think you're right. I can't remember much about it now. I'd have to go back and look. Kind of the other thing about that, and then what we were talking about with their sound, and one of the notes I took about it was it's so great because they clearly have this theme, and instead of just going ultra heavy to kind of like mask that theme or at least take away from it, their sound adds to it. You don't lose it because it's too heavy or has shrieking, growling vocals. It's very much, here's what we want to tell you, and you can understand it.
Yeah, 100%. I think that makes for, like I said, a really easy listen. And like I said, I don't think easy listening metal is a thing, but if it was, like this group would fit very well in that. It was a really good album. Saturday Night Satan with All Things Black. Time to move on to Chris. Chris, you've got 2 choices this week as well. What is your first choice of the week?
First choice of this week is going to be a band that I've already mentioned before as kind of an intro piece on a previous episode. They're a Swedish, labeled as stoner rock band named, I'm probably going to struggle with this pronunciation again, but Skraeckoedlan. Like I mentioned in that previous episode, I won't get into their bio and all that too much as I've already done that, but they're so much more than stoner rock. They have just this spacey kind of sci-fi, everything about it. They're the band I mentioned how they have created an entire sci-fi novel based around this new album, Vermilion Sky. They had an online video game that you could play to win merchandise from them. And they're just all about the story behind the album. And even within that, they're all about the story with their sound. Listening just right into the opening track, Cosmic Dawn, gives you this feeling of kind of floating through space. And then as you continue toward the middle, you feel like you've really reached kind of a planet that's maybe inhabited, and you're kind of in the middle of this bustling kind of alien landscape, all the way into the end track, Astronautilus. But just makes you, it's the climax soundtrack, I would say, to a sci-fi movie. Just makes you feel like you're on your ship flying away from a planet on the verge of exploding, or just something equally as crazy. Front to back, just amazing sci-fi sounds, really riff-driven music, all with this kind of 2001: A Space Odyssey backing to it. Just absolutely loved it, and so nice I had to mention them twice.
That's fair enough. Definitely an interesting sound. There's no question about it. I don't know that I even have like a specific genre I could pick out for them, but we always appreciate getting suggested other bands. That was actually one of the bands that we had picked, suggested that one, and Chris jumped on it. And definitely check out Vermilion Sky, and I'll let Chris continue to pronounce the name of that band. So, but you'll find it linked on our Facebook post because we are following them on Facebook. But Mike, your thoughts on this one? Yeah,
I definitely agree that tagging them as Swedish stoner rock just felt like you were totally selling them short or not doing the depth of their sound justice. It's weird when you consider what they are. You just think, man, that there's no way this could be this accessible, because it shouldn't be. And yet the songs are catchy enough that they pull you in even when you have no idea what any of it's about. Like, I think that's really impressive when you can retain someone's interest despite having no clue what's going on. I also think it's funny that they've kind of built their own like universe, including a video game. It seems like one of those instances where maybe something that exists in our world already, they said sucked, and someone like challenged them like, well, why don't you just make your own? And they were like, okay, let's do that then. And then here we are. Like that never really happens, but this feels like that.
Yeah, it's kind of sad I didn't get to play it before the full release of the album to try to win anything. I feel like I could have got a pretty decent high score.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's a nice crossover there between all of our music content and our video game content. But check out Vermilion Sky, Chris's first choice of the week. Chris, you have 2 choices as always. What is your second choice of the week?
Yep, I believe this is my first trip to Germany. Not necessarily our first trip as a podcast, but I'm going to be going to a band called Ivory Tower with their new album, Heavy Rain. They're labeled as a kind of progressive metal band, but from some of the reviews and just my initial listening to the album, this album has been said to lean more toward kind of the melodic hard rock than some of their previous entries. I know Angry Metal Guy didn't have the best review of the album, but he did mention that their previous entry, Stronger, leaned a little more toward the proggy side. But to me, that almost made this more accessible in my eyes. opening up with their first track, Black Rain. Like I mentioned, it started off as melodic hard rock, and it kind of made me question, like, is this really going to be a prog rock album? But then once you roll into track 2, is my favorite track, Holy War, you get more of those sweeping keyboard, operatic vocals, and it just has a very catchy chorus. So it's kind of sprinkled throughout, and like I said, that made it much more accessible to me, and I almost enjoyed it more for that fact. Some of the standout tracks on this one, like I mentioned, Holy War is my favorite by far, but you also have The Destination, 60 Seconds. But really, give the entire album a listen, but those are just some of the highlights.
Yeah, these guys were one of the bands that I kind of written down when we go through Mike's list the first time. I usually try to pick the ones that I think could end up being choices of mine, and they were one of the ones that were on that list. You're right, Angry Metal Guy maybe wasn't a huge fan of this release. He did make a good point comparing Francis Soto, the vocalist, to a sound somewhere between Yorn and Blaze Bayley, which I can kind of hear that a little bit. It definitely wasn't a prog album. I think the only prog characteristic it had is some of the songs felt like they could have been about a minute shorter. Felt like they just kind of kept going and going, but it wasn't in a prog way. But again, that's, a musical choice. It was still really good, but you kind of felt like some of those could have been tightened up, and you would have gone from a song that was good to a song that might have been really, really good. But overall, I did enjoy the entire album. And I think if you were going into it looking for a prog album, maybe that is where you might end up thinking it fell short. But I think if you're just going in looking for good music, I think you're going to enjoy Ivory Tower's Heavy Rain. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Anytime you can draw comparisons to Yorn, I think you're doing something right. But at the same time, I think a lot of times with the proggier stuff, the vocals tend to be kind of what lags. And here you have the new singer, a less proggy sound, but I think probably stronger vocals. I haven't heard the former stuff, but I think his vocals definitely fit what they were doing this time around. And yeah, I do agree that maybe a couple of the songs could have been shaved down to about the 4 to 5 minute mark. And I think without some of the prog elements, you don't really need the extra long tracks, really.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. But overall, again, really great release. Yeah. Definitely check out Ivory Tower's Heavy Rain. I thought it was really good, despite what the Angry Metal Guy says. But that's the joy of reviewing, is that we can disagree on different things. But we're going to move on to my choices this week. Got 2 really good choices for you. 2 very interesting bands. We're going to start with the first band, Fatal Fire, with the album Arson. Now, first things first, do want to shout out Mike, because it's a little bit of a challenge finding a band named Fatal Fire with a album called Arson, because that brings up every news story that has ever happened. So yeah, that was maybe kind of a misstep there, but otherwise they're a power metal group from Germany, female fronted group. This is their debut album. They were formed in 2020 during the pandemic and kind of took some time to write their songs. I felt like even though they list themselves as power metal, I definitely heard some speed metal and some thrash kind of vibes in there as well. I feel like it's very guitar and drum driven. I think you're going to hear that kind of right off the bat, but I thought it was really good for their first album. Standout tracks to me were Destruction. Really enjoyed the guitar solo later in that track. Kingslayer. The guitar intro of Dawn of Fate was really cool. And then I really appreciated Crossroads, because so much of the album kind of felt very similar, almost like they were one really long song and kind of chopped it up. But Crossroads was kind of the one track on the album that I thought had a different feeling to it, different sound, which really kind of broke it up because it was in the middle of that album. So I thought that really helped balance the sound out. But overall, I thought it was really good from Fatal Fire, the album Arson. Mike, your thoughts?
It's kind of wild. I feel like this was like the Germany themed episode. We didn't really think of that ahead, or we didn't coordinate that intentionally. But yeah, I mean, Germany's most promising power metal newcomers is what they were tagged as. Definitely had more of a classic metal vibe to me too. Kind of cool having a female vocalist who doesn't lean so heavily into the operatic type singing. It was very much just straight up metal vocals. Also not growly, death, guttural stuff either. I thought that stood out really well. And, it's funny that we keep going back to these German bands just this last couple weeks, and it's clear that that tradition of metal music is being carried on by these newer acts, and that's really awesome.
Yeah, no question about that. Germany, a lot of musical talent there, and keeping metal alive for sure. Chris, your thoughts on Fatal Fire?
Yeah, I'm going to double down on the love for Crossroads just because it had a great drum intro to it. Also had strong openings on Destruction and Ashes Remain. So those are some more standout tracks I'd recommend to people. But as you mentioned, the vocals from Svenja Roman just really kind of carried it for me. It was the perfect mix of what you would expect from clean vocals in metal and also a little bit more toward the harsh side, but never too far one way or the other.
Yeah, I thought it was a really solid first album. Definitely check out Fatal Fire with Arson. Going to move into something a little bit different for pick number 2, getting out of the power metal. I may lose my power metal card for not picking either a power metal or melodic metal band. We're going to go alternative rock for the second choice. It's a band called Stone Turtle with the album Blackout. They were formed in 2019 in Genoa, Italy. They were basically created because 2 other groups, Hydra and Blank, both dissolved, that allowed this group to kind of come together with members of that group. They mentioned metal and grunge influences. I definitely heard an alternative rock influence here. Some of these tracks really felt like they could have come out of the late 90s and alternative rock. Standout tracks to me were Blackout, Doors of Perception, which had a very late 90s alternative sound to it, and Isolation, which I thought was a really good vocal harmony in this song. And I think that's the one point I would make about this album is there's a lot of potential for this group. I think there's a very high ceiling for Stone Turtle. I think some of their tracks to me felt a little flat as far as everything in it, from the vocals to the music, felt like it fell into a very narrow spectrum. So, and that typically, I don't want to say typically, you have alternative rock that does that. If you go back to that era, there are bands that followed that path. So I think there will be a lot of people that will be very happy to hear songs like that. But there were other songs like Isolation where I felt like they expanded that range and got outside of that flat area, and they really created something that was really amazing. So I'm hoping that maybe as they continue to go forward, we see a little bit more of that, because there's a lot of vocal talent in this group. There's a lot of musical talent in this group. I think they can even go beyond what they've done in this first album and really create something amazing. But for this album, I thought they really did a great job. But like I said, I think it's also about the potential of what this group could do going forward. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think just in general that the sound that they achieve, that alternative rock sound, is kind of underserved at this point. And it was refreshing that as I was getting into it, at no point did I think, oh, that sounds gimmicky, like what they're doing there. There was none of that. It was just straight up alternative rock. And I think we could definitely use more of that. Really love Blackout. Intro to that song was really cool. Kind of thought that should have opened the album after hearing the first track going into that. But yeah, overall, really enjoyed it.
Definitely. Stone Turtle with Blackout. Chris, your thoughts?
Hey, if I'm able to switch it up and pick a power metal band, then you're allowed to go off and pick an alternative band. There's no rules saying otherwise. Yeah, I was really surprised going into this, hearing a band named Stone Turtle. I was almost expecting another stoner metal band and was probably just going to set it aside. But once I jumped in, I was pleasantly surprised. Really love the groove openings and Doors of Perception and Killing for the Master. There's some very strong vocals in Isolation. And just like Mike, Blackout was my favorite track. And I actually made the same note that he had mentioned, that I kind of wish it was the opening track. It has a very solid, just rock track and a solo in it, guitar solo that stays with you.
Yeah, 100%. I thought Blackout was my standout track as well, although I really did like Isolation too. But excited to see where Stone Turtle continues to go. Really great release here, Blackout, and definitely excited to see what the next release looks like. So those are our 6 new releases for this week. We're going to step aside. When we come back, we're going to take you into the vault, where we give you classic albums you definitely need to check out. We'll do that on the other side of this time out here on the Nerdcast Empire. Back on the Nerdcast Empire, Music Mondays continues on here on the Nerdcast Empire. Don't forget to check out our website, nerdcastempire.com. You can check out our store there by clicking the link at the top of the website or going to nerdcastempire.com/store. Coming up this Sunday, we have the 50th episode of the Nerdcast Empire. We're going to be talking our favorite anime opening themes of all time. And it's hard to say best when you're talking any kind of music, because it's so subjective, even amongst ourselves. What I think is the best today, in 6 months, I might think something else is the best. But we're going to give you basically some of our favorite ones. And we're going to continue to do this from time to time because we have so many favorites. we're going to try to spotlight, I think, at least 5 each on Sunday's episode to kind of tell you what we really like in anime opening themes that'll be coming up on Sunday. And then, of course, 1 week from today, it's another episode of Music Mondays with the music of April the 5th. Looks like another really outstanding release week for music, so definitely going to check that out next week on the Nerdcast Empire. But it is time to go into the vault, as always, and kind of fitting that we will start with Chris. Chris has picked a very apropos vault pick this week. So, Chris, what do you got?
Yeah, I'm taking a step away from my soundtrack picks, and it was hard not to pick this album after having the eclipse wash over the United States recently. I had to go with Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. It's hard to come up with things to say about this album that haven't already been said. I mean, it's one of the greatest albums of all time, not just of Pink Floyd, but from any act out there. This was the album, the first one to only feature David Gilmour replacing Syd Barrett after he had left the band. They had previously worked kind of side by side on Saucer Full of Secrets, but this is where we really got into the David Gilmour era. And once again, talking about best of all time, David Gilmour up there, maybe on my Mount Rushmore of greatest guitarists. For the tracks that are on here, there's a lot of kind of duality spread throughout. It's tackling the concepts of life and death, light and dark, good and evil, getting old. And they even have songs in here that are dealing with Syd Barrett's deteriorating mental state and health at the time, which seems kind of wild thinking back on it. Like that would almost be as if Metallica made songs about Dave Mustaine's just addictions and whatnot. But they played a lot with tape loops, analog synthesizers, multi-track recording, things that are kind of mainstays now, but back then was kind of cutting edge, or you really had to be thinking kind of on the fly of how to get some of these sounds. A lot of people are going to know some of the top tracks on this one. Time, probably my favorite Pink Floyd song, ironically, of all time. Money, Us and Them. But then you have some other tracks. I'm going to speak on Eclipse, the final song in there, just because it kind of wraps up the album and also referencing the eclipse we just had. But at the end of this album, we get "And everything under the sun is in tune, but the sun is eclipsed by the moon." And just this idea that there's all this good and all this light that we should be able to seize out there, but all this darkness and demons just constantly getting in our way. And it's just one of those great visuals from Floyd, Roger Waters, Gilmour, just the whole group together.
Well, first off, to quote the great Master Shake, you can't have birth without death. It's the duplicitous edge we all walk upon. So I feel like that's an important note. Secondly, I want to talk about this album. I was potentially going to pick this week for my vault pick because we are up to 1973 for our albums, and that's when it was released. But something that maybe this generation isn't aware of, but it was definitely something that was more popular in the news kind of when we were in high school and middle school, was the rumors that somehow the creation of this album was tied to the movie The Wizard of Oz, that you could start this album when the MGM lion roared and play it as you're watching The Wizard of Oz and things would line up. Now, I actually did do that. Some classmates and I, in my junior year of high school, got together at one of our friends' houses and actually did this, not under the influence of anything, because I feel like it's one of those things that maybe you should do under the influence of something to enhance the experience. But there were definitely things that lined up. I think, looking at it years later, some of those things were probably just coincidence that it happened to work out that way. But in the pre-internet life, just seemed like the coolest thing ever that this was possible. Found a new word called apophenia, which is the tendency to perceive connections between unrelated things. So that is what they kind of consider that to be. But it is a great classic album. You're right. A lot of the big tracks, for Pink Floyd aren't necessarily on this album. Money is probably the one that gets played most on classic rock radio, but it is definitely a wild trip and a very fitting album for our recent eclipse that we had in this area. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, to be fully transparent, I'd never listened to this album before today. I'm not a huge Pink Floyd fan. I never have been, but I understand why people enjoy this for sure. I didn't realize that Alan Parsons was an engineer on it, which was pretty wild to find out that he also worked as an engineer on Abbey Road and Let It Be. So a guy that I had no idea had this career in production before his actual or during his actual music career. That was kind of surprising. Again, not being a huge Pink Floyd fan, I could tell listening to this that this is clearly them at their like completed sound. Like go forward from here, this is what Pink Floyd sounds like. I'm more of a fan of stuff beyond this, but can't argue with it. It's a classic.
No doubt about it. So this was an Alan Parsons project, is
Yes,
what you're saying.
Absolutely was.
So,
how about that?
And this started what I would say after Dark Side of the Moon. You had Wish You Were Here in 1975, Animals in 1977, and then probably my favorite album overall in 1979, The Wall. So really, this was kind of the beginning of a string of the greatest albums once again of all time.
Yeah, I think like Mike said, I feel like this was where they kind of completed their sound, and then over the next 6 or 7 years, they really were just hammering out hit albums one after the other after they found what that sound was supposed to be.
It's something that even if it's not necessarily for you, when you hear it, you can appreciate it. I think that's really the best way to put it.
It's the best classic rock or music of any kind is when you can listen to something you don't necessarily care for and say, this might not be for me, but I know somebody out there is really going to love this because there's a lot of talent in it. And I feel like that definitely describes Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. Speaking of talent, we're going to move on to Mike's pick, and Mike is continuing through the alphabet, and we are up to the letter H this week, which on this show probably can only mean one band for your vault pick.
See, if I'd have known you were going to say that, I would have had something hilarious lined up to throw out there, which would not have been the
I figured you could have just come up with something.
I am Hanson, obviously. I love Hanson. Classic.
Now Chris is sad that you didn't pick Hanson.
I was more voting for Hoobastank, honestly.
Oh, Hoobastank, yeah.
That actually was a good album. their first one or whatever their hit album was, but
I think they only had one.
I'm assuming. They probably had like 8, and I just only know they're one.
Yeah, so here we are on the letter H. With this run through, as I kind of mentioned before, trying to gear it towards albums that I kind of discovered early in my journey of finding what kind of music I'm into, which means a lot of this stuff is late 90s, early 2000s stuff. And in most cases, the albums that maybe a band isn't known for, or something that's come out years after maybe they had their most successful album. And to fit with the impromptu theme of the week, which is Germany, evidently, my pick for this week is the 9th studio album from the German power metal band Helloween, and it is The Dark Ride from the year 2000.
First off, Hoobastank had 7 albums.
Wow.
So there is that. But
and they still never came up with a good name for their band. That's amazing.
It did not, for sure. But I love Helloween. This is a little bit different era of Helloween, but it's the era that you got into Helloween. So I think that kind of is why this album pick makes the most sense.
Yeah, it's funny because I don't know what it would have been like had I been there from the beginning in the 80s and gone through the Kai Hansen period and Michael Kiske. And in 94, when they brought in Andy Darris, like thinking of him as the second singer or third singer, or, just a guy who maybe didn't belong. Because, I mean, at this point, this is the year 2000, and, he moved fast forward to 2024. He's still with the band. Like, he is the most tenured singer that they have. It's the last album to have Uli Kusch and Roland Grappow on it. They ended up going on to form Master Plan. The 2 singles on the album, If I Could Fly and Mr. Torture, really good songs. But it's some of the darker songs that were kind of a departure from Helloween's more bright power metal-y sound that I got into back then. And I think it worked really well with Andy Darris's vocals. Those songs are like Escalation 666, The Departed, The Dark Ride, the title track, really cool. But you still kind of had those glimpses at that classic Helloween sound on songs like All Over the Nations and We Damn the Night. Still had that kind of bright feeling to it mixed in with the darker sounds. And it's really what got me into the band. And, from there I went on to check out the Keeper albums and the things moving forward. And even the period of time with Kiske on vocals for, Pink Bubbles Go Ape and Chameleon. This was kind of the gateway, but it brought me into kind of the whole discography.
It's amazing because I mentioned to you on Discord today that even though Andy Darris has been the longest tenured vocalist he's still probably the most underappreciated because he happened to follow Kai Hansen and Michael Kiske, who are maybe two of the all-time greatest power metal vocalists anywhere. Like Andy Darris in his own right is really great. Mr. Torture is one of my favorite Helloween songs. I didn't realize it was on this album until I looked it up, but that's a great song. And it, to me, when you hear that, it sounds like Helloween. I mean, so many of these groups, if they don't pick a lead singer, a new lead singer that just sounds like the old guy, a la Journey, there's oftentimes a change in the sound when they bring in somebody new or they have somebody else take over when somebody leaves. You think of a band like Genesis. You know, when they really got into the Phil Collins stuff, like the very early Genesis with Phil Collins singing sounds kind of like that classic sound. And then that just continued to morph toward that pop sound that you got in the 80s. You know, Andy Darris' stuff, like you said, there is some darker stuff on this album that sounds a bit different, but you hear a song like Mr. Torture and think, well, any one of their singers could have sung that and it would have sounded like Helloween. And this is a great album. Helloween is great. I mean, I say that every time you bring them up, like, they're just great. You should listen to all of their albums, including this one. And
it's kind of interesting because I did some research kind of looking for like a biography on them because there's still a lot I need to learn about their history over the years. And when they fired Michael Kiske, a lot of that had to do with his kind of departure from heavy metal and wanting to do almost more like country sounding music. So you kick him out of the band because he wasn't really wanting to create what they consider to be Helloween music. And then you bring in Andy Darris, who is on board. He wants to do that. It's almost like we know what the band sounds like. If you don't want to sound like that anymore, we'll have to get rid of you and bring in someone who will sound like that. So it's almost like your personnel decisions were with the goal of maintaining a certain sound as opposed to we don't care what this dude sounds like. Let's just go in some other direction. It's almost like they're being really protective of that IP, essentially.
Which, again, makes sense why this stuff really sounds just like the classic Helloween before Darris took over, because that's clearly what they were going for, which is crazy. But new album coming from Helloween in 2025. So I think we are all looking forward to that. I think that's going to be awesome. Chris, your thoughts on Helloween?
Yeah, I'm sad you didn't pick Walls of Jericho. No, prior to this, the Jericho reference to Chris Jericho was the only knowledge I had of Helloween. So getting to sit down and kind of listen to this album in preparation for this was also my first introduction to them via you. So I may have to get the order that you listen to them in just so I can follow down your same path. But I don't think it'll really matter. I love this whole album. So I imagine if what you're saying is true as far as the vocalists almost not necessarily not mattering, but it's all just really great music across the board. I don't think I can go wrong with listening to any of their other albums to follow this one up.
Yeah, I'm curious if you can even remember what that order was.
I'd have to put some thought into it. There was something I was going to look up really fast. They had an album that came out before this. In 1999, they released an album, Metal Jukebox. Really cool. I mean, they cover He's a Woman, She's a Man, Scorpions, Locomotive Breath, Space Oddity, From Out of Nowhere, Faith No More. One of the more notable covers for me is they cover the song Hocus Pocus. And it's a tremendous cover. And I think everyone should go and check that song out.
I can't believe that hasn't come up. I want to know when Hocus Pocus by Focus comes out, because
it's a great question.
Watch it be like 1968. And it'll be before this album Vault thing, because that's an all-time classic. And
1971.
Oh, missed it.
Oh.
Bummer. We may have to come back around to that. Clearly, there was nothing else on that album. It didn't make any of the list, but that's a bonus vault pick this week. Listen to Hocus Pocus by Focus, and then the Halloween version as well.
The cover does it justice.
Watch the live video that goes along with Focus as well.
Maybe we should link that here in the YouTube video version of this, the YouTube video of them playing it live, because there's nothing like that. That is, 70s gave you some wild stuff, man, and that's definitely one of them, But yeah, definitely check out Helloween. Any of their albums, obviously, Mike's vault pick this week. We're going to go to my vault pick. And as I mentioned, I nearly picked Dark Side of the Moon because it came out in 1973. But as has probably come up before on this podcast, will certainly come up again. I've always been a big fan of Billy Joel. Saw him and on New Year's Eve, 1999 at Madison Square Garden when I thought the world was going to end. didn't, thankfully.
You don't know that.
Well, that's true, but didn't seem to end that night. But Billy Joel put on one of the best shows I think I've ever seen. Over 3 hours of basically all of his hits and cover songs and everything else. It was really, really great. But the album I'm picking is one of his first big albums, and that was Piano Man, which was released in November of 1973. I think everybody who has listened to any classic rock music at all, and maybe even people who haven't, know the title track Piano Man. And Piano Man, the song, is great. I think it is a little overplayed, maybe not so much anymore, but when radio was a thing, I feel like classic rock stations played it a little bit to death. So I feel like there's a little backlash on that song. But to me, there's 4 other songs on that album that I really like. It starts off with Traveling Prayer, which if you've never heard that song, it is a bluegrass song. And it's one thing listening to Billy Joel on his Sirius XM channel when that pops up is he's got such a wide range of influences and has always been big on trying to write songs that tie into those influences. He wrote the song She's Always a Woman, trying to write a Gordon Lightfoot song. And, you know, in that program kind of sung it like Gordon Lightfoot would sing it to kind of, and you're like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But, you know, Uptown Girl definitely has that 50s, 60s rock vibe to it. So he's got crazy influences, and Traveling Prayer, certainly a different song than probably what most people are used to out of Billy Joel. Also on that first side, you've got You're My Home, just kind of a soft rock song, but really solid song. The Ballad of Billy the Kid is great. I think the live version of it is actually a little better than the one on this album, but definitely check that out. And then the last track, the 7-minute, 15-second Captain Jack. That's kind of a wild song. Feels very much like a stream of consciousness type of song, but really enjoy that. Billy Joel to me is certainly one of the all-time greats in classic rock. And I feel like this was the album where people started to kind of look at him alongside of like Elton John as this pop star that was going to continue to do bigger things as his career continued. But definitely check out Piano Man, the album from Billy Joel, 1973. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, once again, this was an album that I'd not listened to front to back going into this. And my first thoughts were, wait, there's a bluegrass song on here? Like Billy Joel opened an album with a bluegrass song? That's not what I was expecting. And like you said, Piano Man may be overplayed, but I think it's really a great example of his vocal ability. I mean, his singing sounds great on that song. Ain't No Crime to me sounded like it should have been the theme for a 70s sitcom. It just has that kind of like jaunty 70s feel to it. And at this point, as I'm going through, I'm just thinking, is Billy Joel underrated? Like I feel like he's not necessarily given that same star ranking as Elton John, and I'm not really sure why that is. Yeah, this is all over the place as far as the sounds go on this album. I didn't realize he was that diverse in his especially over the course of a single album. Like, I understand the guy's been around decades, and his stuff in the 80s doesn't sound like this, and his stuff in the 90s doesn't sound like any of that. But I didn't realize kind of intra album that you'd have that same level of kind of all over the place. But yeah, it was really impressive.
Yeah, he's definitely got a lot of different varied music backgrounds. And like Mike said, not just over the years, which obviously the vocal style changed as he got into the 80s and 90s, but even very much on this album. And actually, as we're recording this podcast on Sunday, they're about to air a concert on CBS, which you probably can check out on their Paramount Plus app after the fact. I'm guessing they'll probably archive it, but definitely check that out as he just finished his 100th consecutive show in his residency at Madison Square Garden, which is kind of crazy when in 1999 they weren't sure if that wasn't going to be his last show at Madison Square Garden because there was talk of him retiring and all this other stuff. And all these years later, he is still kicking it. In fact, just released a new song just a few weeks ago, which is kind of crazy. But Chris, your thoughts on Billy Joel and Piano Man?
Yeah, kind of like we talked about Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. This is kind of where I feel like Billy Joel really came into his sound. It's hard to even say sound because, like you said, there's just so many different kind of inspirations to him and places he goes with his voice. So he kind of came into his sounds. The Stranger will always be my favorite album of his, but I don't think that's a hot take. That's kind of like one of the top albums of his of all time. But I think this one definitely deserves its flowers and love for being that first release that really got him on track to create some of those later albums of his, like Turnstiles, The Stranger, and so many others.
You talk about The Stranger, maybe we'll come back around to that when we get to that year, but That album literally had 7 hits. The first 7 songs on that album, Moving Out, The Stranger, Just the Way You Are, Scenes from an Italian Restaurant, Vienna, Only the Good Die Young, and She's Always a Woman. Those are the first 7 tracks on that album. That's nuts. Like, those are all hit songs that he had. So yeah, I would agree. Probably not a hot take, but very true that I think a lot of people think very highly of that. But again, that was 2 or 3 albums after The Piano Man. So you really felt like this is kind of where all that momentum started for Billy Joel. So those are our picks from the vault this week. That means we are ready to wrap things up for this week's edition of the Nerdcast Empire. Great to have you along with us again for Music Mondays. Don't forget this Sunday, we're talking our favorite anime opens of all time. And 1 week from tonight, we'll come back with Music Mondays with the best music from April the 5th. Looking forward to that. Don't forget to check out our website, nerdcastempire.com. A huge thanks to the guys, as always, for taking time out of their week to not only record this, but a thanks to Mike for putting all this stuff together to make this so much easier to do. And a big thanks to Stove Lake Media for their continued support of our podcast. And thanks to you for listening each and every week on the Nerdcast Empire. That wraps things up. We'll talk to you again next week. And don't forget to join the Empire, the Nerdcast Empire.